my first job out of college at the Annapolis Evening Capital. And my boss gave me what I needed to get a visa to get into the country for 30 days. And then he said, you'd be on your own. We are a small paper and we cannot afford life insurance on a war correspondent.
Yeah.
So we'll give you 30 days and then you're on your own. And if you don't find a job in 30 days, you're out.
And in Time, you land a gig with Time magazine.
I did. And I landed there at a very odd time because the first troop withdrawals were being announced at the end of '69. And I came in the end of January, the beginning of February of 1970. And so when the first 500 troop withdrawals were being announced, I think that was the last October, the sense was the war was over. And this is 1970, and as you know, the war's not over till 1975.
Yeah.
But that was very much the perception. And so when I landed in Saigon and started walking the streets, going to Associated Press, the UPI, to all the obvious places to try to hire lots of people, they all said, the war's over. We're sending people home now. And the same thing happened when I finally hit Time magazine. Marsh Clark, the bureau chief, said, we had 12 people here last month. We have 3 now and a photographer, and I have a budget to hire. I know this war isn't over, and if you can do it, you'll have your chance.
I want to ask you then, kind of on the, because it comes up a number of times in the memoir, sort of your identity as a feminist, just to use that phrase. And there are 2 moments that come to my mind. One that seems very feminist and one that seems, not quite so feminist. One is your husband he's an enlisted soldier. And then at a certain point, if I remember right, he's got some drawings or cartoons or something posted up where he's working. And the officer, it's to cut to the chase, the officer tells him to take them down because they're critical of the war. He refuses to do it, kind of on principle, sort of a First Amendment thing. And then he's told, that doesn't really work in the Army. Anyway, so he refuses to take these things down. And he gets into trouble and he gets busted down to private from wherever, he'd been a few ranks above that, busted down to private. So you've got this married couple, and as you say, it's the only married couple in Vietnam, right? He's a private, and she's a correspondent for Time magazine. So if you're at the dinner party and people say, well, what do you do? And you say, well, I'm a private in the Army. Okay, that's cool, but whatever. What do you do? I'm a correspondent for Time magazine. Did that? I don't remember that you ever really discussed that in the memoir, but did that, how did that go when you had a position that, has some status attached to it? Being a low-ranking enlisted guy in the Army, doesn't have a lot of status attached to it. Was that ever
an issue in the marriage?
Was that ever an issue, or did that ever come up, or?
Preston, I was married to a man who probably is more of a feminist than I am. So whatever else issues arose in this marriage over 20 years, he supported me 100%. Was extremely proud. And afterwards, when people would ask both of us questions, he'd say, "She's the one with the stories. Ask her." But in fact, I hope that this book makes clear that he has stories, and they are extremely interesting stories, as you're addressing right now, because he's married to a woman correspondent and because he has a colonel who says, if anything from this office ever appears in Time magazine, then you are busted, you are humping the boonies on I Corps. All that was extremely interesting. The military's perception of him having a wife was extremely interesting, but for him, it was a non-issue. The issue for him was he and I were both very much, as students, opposed to the war. Here he was lending his body, and this is a man who was deeply Catholic. This was a man who'd been in a monastery out of high school, studying to be a Christian brother.
Studying to be a monk, yeah.
Studying to be a monk.
Wow.
His earnestness, I could not have imagined him. He was carrying an M16. He did not have M16. He did not have to kill. And I don't know what would have happened if he had to. I cannot even fathom the repercussions of that.
The other event is one that actually reminds me of something. And this is when I was in the Navy. We'd been out at sea for a long time. And then I forget where we were, but a group of guys I was with, we spotted what looked to us like, an American gal maybe sitting on a bench. Turned out, I think she was from Australia or England, something like that. We gathered around her, and there wasn't, and you describe a moment like this, where these guys come up to you, and it's not so much like a sensual thing, but it's almost like we're going to gather around this person who's a reminder of home, a reminder of civilization. But I just remember as we gathered around that bench, sort of beholding this thing of wonder, that we'd almost forgotten existed after being out at sea for a few months. You describe a moment like that. Now, when you're the object of that kind of thing, that doesn't strike, that doesn't come across, as some sort of, like feminist moment, if what I'm saying makes any sense. But what do you, when you reflect back on that, and it probably happened, I'm guessing it happened a lot. It just sort of, you get these looks like, oh, because of everything you symbolize to the guys, right? What sort of thoughts do you have in response to that?
I completely understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
It is so familiar and not unpleasant. There was such a sense when I was out in the field, and I want to make the distinctions when I was and when I wasn't.
Yeah.
When I was out in the field, there was nothing sexual. I was everybody's big sister. I mean, I was 23 to 25 and they were 18 and 19 typically. And there was, apart from the years, and those are huge years, socially they were huge, and educationally they were huge.
At that age, yeah.
Sure. At that age,
Yeah.
And so I really was, I can't tell you how many times I was told, you remind me of my big sister. That wasn't a metaphor. It was real. It was a way of relating. And yes, it was, when soldiers were pressing guns in my hand and I was refusing, it was because they wanted to do something for me. They wanted to take care of me. They wanted to bring home that way. None of that offended me. None of that offended. I felt like I had more than dual things going on in my head. Feminism was being defined then, in the late 60s and early 70s. Yes, there was an early feminist movement, but that feminist movement was redefining what it meant. And all of us, I don't care how out there you were, was struggling with what that meant. How much do you give to a marriage? How much if you don't cry? Still women executives run into bathrooms to cry, you don't cry in front of you don't look scared. You don't allow yourself to be scared. And I'm sure that was true for men as well as women, but I felt the additional, I had more to prove. I had to prove. So to my colleagues, that was intense. Out in the field, it was, I allowed for that I allowed and enjoyed, because it meant that I got stories that nobody else got. I had grunts telling me their life stories in ways that I don't know if they told each other. I can't speak to that. But I know they didn't tell my male colleagues. I know they wouldn't. I'm sitting in bunkers with people who are speaking their hearts, and smoking joints, and so that was the upside. And I felt like I got access to things that my colleagues didn't. The downside was at the upper levels, generals, colonels, the upper echelon officers would always defer to my male colleagues. Always easier to get an interview if you were a male correspondent from Time than if you were me. Always. That was it. And with my colleagues, it's an interesting thing because while I was writing for Time, I also chose to, out of gratitude, largely, send first-person stories back to the Annapolis Evening Capital, to my editor there, who I think paid me $20 or $25 a story. But the point being that it was an outlet for me in a certain way, and it was exactly what they wanted. And my male colleagues, looking at the first-person stories I wrote, were uniformly appalled.
Really?
Why would you write that? Why would you demean yourself? Why would you show those feelings? Why would you let on that you have those? Why would you go public with those feelings that probably all of us have, but we're not going to talk about it. That was an eye-opener to me.
When I read the memoir, which I think is a great memoir, I noticed that we started in Quang Tri, which is up in I Corps, at the right at the northern edge of old South Vietnam, and the memoir ends back at Quang Tri, and that part of the memoir, it's unique, and you tell unique stories. You come under fire there at Khe Sanh, right? If I remember right, a helicopter you're on. Takes some pretty heavy fire, you're not sure if you're going to make it. Yeah, and so it's unique because, this is a female journalist writing about experiencing these things. But the bulk of the memoir focuses on your time in Saigon. And for me, that's, for a person who's spent a lot of time, thinking about Vietnam, talking about Vietnam, reading about Vietnam, that's the part of memoir that was most beneficial to me, because here I'm really learning about what's going on in Saigon, or I'm learning about this person's experiences in Saigon. So the memoir kind of reflects what you hear sometimes people say, that there were very different wars in Vietnam. There was the war in the boonies, which you experienced a little bit up there in Quang Tri. And then there's the war in Saigon, and there are incidents there in Saigon. A bottle is thrown and hits your husband in the head. A bullet rings out from nowhere. You tell the story of a U.S. truck that's just plowing through and hits a kid on a motorcycle, and these kinds of things. When I think about what you write about Saigon, I mean, the two things that most strike me is the section where you are given the assignment to write about the war's effect on children. And so you spend time exploring that, writing about it. You quote some of the things that you wrote at that time. I don't know the extent to which those quotations actually survived in the final product there at Time. But can you just talk about that a little bit, about the things you saw in Saigon? Here the theme is what the war has done to the country, the impact of the war on the country, thinking particularly of the children. What sort of things do you have as you reflect back on that?
I'm going to begin, Preston, and I promise you I'll get to exactly where we are.
Yeah.
But with an explanation of why Quang Tri beginning and end, the helicopter that shot down, basically destroyed under me, why that story begins and ends. And that story went into over 25 years, a lot of different places in the book, a lot before it found its place first in the beginning and then broken beginning in half.
Yeah.
And when I do speeches, I typically say, if I'm reading from that part, I typically read a part of that and then I say, okay, you've heard that before. You know what that sounds like. I'm just reading that to you, and that's here for one reason, to tell you that, yes, I was a woman and I did that. Done that, did that, you know it there. Now, let's get on to, so your perception of this interestingly, because no one else has picked up on it in this way,
Hmm.
is that those are two very different stories. That's where she has to prove that she's one of them. And that, I mean, certainly that runs through the whole book, because the having to prove isn't just a one event thing, but the development of understanding that, yeah, in the world of journalism, then you could have hierarchically lined what was the most important. Maybe City Hall, Washington, D.C., politics. Okay, crime, City Hall, Washington, D.C., the war. Okay, the war. That's where where only the best and the toughest get to go. Okay. So I realized early on, or pretty well into it, that most of the people who've come up that route, most of the men who've come up that route, are pretty singularly focused on proving themselves in that world. And it may make for some exciting news coverage, but it doesn't necessarily make for the most insightful news coverage. So thank you, Preston. The rest of the book is this young woman's evolution in understanding that, and understanding what does make it. And what makes it is seeing, and you really pulled out, again, something that nobody's else asked, the humanity in every story. And that means going doggone deeper. And that means it's not just an American war of interest to Americans about the American war. It is a war within other people's country. And it isn't enough to just count the bodies of ours that come home. It is essential to watch the destruction of an agrarian country because the difference between the French War and the American wars is our bombing. So we clear out the countrysides, basically. We move everybody to refugee camps and then into the cities. There were no cities. These became just hovels along the sidewalks. Of people who used to be farmers, for whom there is no, and all the men are now drafted. So there are no men, so they're women and their children. And who raises these children, and how do these women who were uneducated get jobs? And some become prostitutes. And I mean, it goes, it is just the endless spiral of how ugly it looks. So yes, you bring me back to the children of war. The orphans, some of them are orphans. And many of them are children that have been abandoned, given up to orphanages because their mothers now have 7 children to raise. They have to work as housekeepers at the bases. Nobody can watch these children. Maybe it's the handicapped child that was born. Maybe it's the baby that can't be taken care of. But the woman thinks she's giving it to an orphan. She knows she's not going to feed this baby. She's giving it to an orphanage temporarily in hopes that it'll be fed and taken care of. And then when she's perhaps in a better place, she can reclaim it. Well, that never happened. She couldn't reclaim. There was no such thing as temporary. And no, they starved and died in orphanages. And so I spent weeks in orphanages. I spent on the Children of War assignment. And then I spent a week in the, what was the name? The plastic surgery hospital, the Center for Reconstructive Surgery. The orphanages were horrible. You watched the poor, untrained, uneducated woman from one bowl go from one mouth to the next mouth, same spoon, next mouth. How many died that week? And the pretty Asian kids weren't allowed to be adopted because they'd bring in more money from the Americans who felt bad about this, or from other foreigners to the orphanages. So the orphanages were a travesty. Yeah. Now I go to the plastic surgery, the utter opposite. Clean, American, run by a few really dedicated doctors and well-funded and beautiful, filled with children who've experienced one kind or another of horrible, disforming burns. And as the doctor said, our job isn't to make these kids look more beautiful. They come here looking distorted in every way. We make it so that their mouths can move and they can eat. We make it so that some eye vision as possible in this total scarred, bloated face. That probably was, Preston, one of the most horrible times of my life. These children are children, they're babies, they're children, and they're hard to look at. They're just hard to look at. So that was part of it.
How did that, I mean, we can talk about it, I mean, you're on a helicopter that's almost shot down. You're on a helicopter with wounded and dead American troops. I mean, I'm sure that is going to be some kind of life-altering experience. So you could respond in reference to that. You could respond in reference to what you're seeing of the war's impact on these kids. How was the Inette Miller who went to Vietnam, or how was the Inette Miller who went home from Vietnam in 1971 different from the Inette Miller who arrived in Vietnam in 1970 as a result of seeing and experiencing these things?
That's a tough one. That's true. I mean, a tough one because I only want to answer it as honestly as possible.
Yeah.
I do talk in the book about, and this wasn't just for me, and I promise you I'll try to get back there, but for the larger, that it was a war that nobody wanted to hear about when you got home. So I remember getting home and first landing in San Francisco at my in-laws' kitchen table, and my husband and I started pulling out the pictures. And I think we probably gave over 10 minutes to quick picture looking at the extended family.
Yeah.
And not a single other question, not a story. You're home. That's a terrible war. We don't want to hear about it. And I would reckon, Preston, that's not the first time you've heard about that from veterans. It was the war. I'm not saying that people coming home from World War II had it easy. I'm certainly not saying that. But I'm saying that, and maybe there were things they could never speak of because they were too horrible.
Right.
But there was not, they came home heroes. They came home a sense that what they'd done was worthwhile. The GIs who came back from Vietnam were shamed, were silenced. And to that degree, I was too. It was a big feather in my cap. Professionally, jobs opened up because I had done this in Vietnam. But what did that mean to me? What did that mean to me? I remember coming home, and again, this is probably more universal than me, and looking how large the lawns looked around the houses, how much space each American had around them. And this was in a very small neighborhood. This was not, we're not talking mega houses. We're talking little bungalows with little grassy front yards and backyards, Yeah. And it seemed huge to me. It seemed wrong. It seemed that level of disconnect seemed, so I guess maybe that was my first inculcation of, the first that I was inculcated in the sense of what community means, what culture means, what agrarian cultural life means, what I really did suck up this culture. I really did do. I don't mean I became Vietnamese. I did not.
Yeah.
Nor did I, did I understand what they were going through. But that was my focus for at least the second half of my time there. Beyond, proving whatever I had to prove, it was proving something to myself that I could understand something and write from that understanding. So I think perhaps if it did anything, Preston, it made me a deeper journalist and less tolerant of superficial kinds of stories. And more, this is going to sound so, because there were some very wonderful reporters out there, and there's some very deep understanding, and I honor. But journalism can be really superficial, maybe more today than ever, because of its many forms. But I mean, not that there aren't forms you can find. Yeah. But that real sense of of frustration of black and white, get the person who says this side, get the person who says that side, and we've got the story. Just didn't do it for me then. I did several stories on prostitution in Saigon. And it's a story that never would a male reporter even consider covering. Just wasn't. Not even if they didn't themselves procure prostitutes. It wasn't. And, you know, thank goodness I had two male bureau chiefs who were sensitive and realized maybe they were, maybe they weren't sensitive. That's not even the point. The point is they realized they had a woman in their employ and maybe this would get a different sort of slant on the story. Yeah. That's probably closer to it. So, you know, Saigon looked like this. Those who were there know Tudo Street, you go down to the main street and there'd be men on the street screaming obscenities about come and have my virgin sister, who of course wasn't. And then you'd go into little booths and have your way. So I spent time with going down on the street and in the afternoon, on an afternoon when it was quiet, and sitting with some of the women, young women, girls, really girls. It's very hard for me not to say girls, who told me their stories, and their stories were almost identical. And you need to know that these girls were, at the time of my conversation, heroin addicts. They had been fed heroin in order to make this happen. So picture a countryside where there's bombing going on, less and less land to support the agriculture that the country thrived on. And they ask one of their daughters as a young teen, maybe 13, 14, maybe, if she'll go and basically go to the United States, go to Saigon on this bus. They put her on a bus, and the assumption is that when she arrives, there are plenty of good jobs as housekeepers at the American bases. That's the assumption. Plenty of good jobs for a girl from the countryside. So they put her there, and she's going to send the money back to the family. And she arrives at the bus terminal where there is an old Vietnamese woman, and this story is repeated over and over and over, who approaches the young girl and says, "Come with me. I'll take care of you. I know I have a house for you to stay in. These girls have no place to go. I have a house for you to stay in. You'll have work. You'll be able to send money back to your family." And they are essentially fed dope and prostituted. And there's no escape. There's truly no escape because they can never go. The shame is so incredibly deep. They can never see their family again. They continue to send money to their family, and there is no other life for them at all. There is no other life. And these are children, and this is everywhere in Vietnam, and in Saigon, I mean, one of the things that happened after Tet was basically the American soldiers were moved out of Saigon because it was so awful and they were so despised, and moved to can't remember the name of the base.
Long Bin, maybe? Or
Long Bin, thank you. Long Bin was created, and that's where all of the GIs were, maybe 30 miles away, sent from Saigon. So there were very few American GIs still there were some. There was at MACV at the military headquarters. There was where my husband worked, which was a MP headquarters. And there are people who do come into Saigon for different purposes. But throughout the country, this exists. Throughout the country, these country girls are sent to places where they will be prostituted, and that's the end of their lives. So, I say in the book that I never judged. I couldn't judge the GIs. These were kids out of high school from either urban, ghettos or rural America that had no options and very little education. And yes, most of them were taught Christianity, but you're not taught Christianity to kill people. So yes, you're not taught Christianity to take advantage of women in that way, but it's all part of the same. Forget what you've been taught because we need you to do this and to be this. So I couldn't judge that. I couldn't even now I can't. What was harder for me to hear, and of course I heard this, in social conversations with my colleagues, was their conversation about their use of these girls. And they joked. They joked about who had the flatter chested girl, who had the younger, who had they would joke about the girls' body parts to each other and who got the best or worst of the deal. It was so ugly. And Preston, I never said a word, and maybe, all the things we don't say that we ought to have said, but I didn't. I just removed myself from the conversations. It was another way of wanting to belong, but not wanting to take part in that, because that was truly horrible. Horrible.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I hear your experiences, and when we tell young men, and they are such young men, boys themselves, to forget everything they've learned about morality and empathy and caring, and go kill other people because they're not humans, they're something else. When we do that, then it's just a really small step to saying, using that girl, I don't see her as a girl, she's just the other.
And there is that inevitable, dehumanization process. You mentioned it at least once where, the point is made. I can't tell a friendly South Vietnamese from a VC.
Ooh.
And so you just come to distrust them all. I'm imagining, let's just do a mental exercise. You and I are sitting in the cafe there, and at the table next door is LBJ and McNamara, and we're in some kind of time warp, and we're listening to them, and none of this is what they were out to do. I mean, I don't think LBJ was out to create the environment that you just described. I don't think he was out to create a situation where 50 years later, veterans are going to be at the VA getting diagnosed with things from Agent Orange. I don't think LBJ is saying, "Gosh, what can we do today that will foster divisions in the country that will persist for the next half century?" This isn't what they set out to do.
Nope.
I mean, I think I'm maybe lecturing again here, but there was some ideal at work, but what happened? So it's a lot easier to ask the question than it is to answer it. But what happened? I mean, I don't think that McNamara wanted this. I don't think LBJ wanted this. I don't think Westmoreland wanted this. They didn't want us 50 years later to be talking about this in this way. You spent a year there, you saw what you saw. What happened?
When we were debating about whether to go into Iraq, I sat there and I said, no. If there is a gift, and I always am looking for the gift in whatever, if there is a gift to Vietnam, it would be the lessons of what not to do and how not to do it. I think most military brass would agree with that at this point, that they've spent many, many years studying what not to do. And it was all of it for naught, is what it felt like at that moment. We are going to do this again? we are going to blindly go into someone else's civil war. We are going to do that. And we're going to make a case that we belong there. And we are going to destroy that country with our very occupation. That was heartbreaking. When I was a kid at Wisconsin and at Berkeley, the places where the war was, being actively protested, and I was very actively protesting. The nature of my protest, Preston, was that our kids are being drafted. Our kids are being sent there. Our kids are being harmed. We, my friends, the people graduating, the males around me, were having to contend with being drafted and then being killed or harmed. Pretty soon after I got there, that ceased to be the issue. It was, holy mackerel, look what we're doing to this other place. And in the name of what? So yes, I opposed, but those two oppositions had nothing in common at all. I don't mean I no longer cared for my college friends. I mean that it became so much deeper, and it became so much more. I became so much more aware. There were people when I arrived in Saigon that would say to me, you should have been here 10 years ago. This city was beautiful. The French left it. Wasn't beautiful. Nothing was beautiful. And let me say, just in case everybody's tired of reading Vietnam depressing books, that there really are funny stories in this.
Really yeah.
There really are. I mean, we are talking about something because this is an interviewer who is serious about this.
Yeah.
This interview could be going a whole other way, where we'd be talking about what were absurdly funny situations.
Yeah, that's right.
As a woman, think about it. Somewhere you have to go to the bathroom in the field. Think about that.
Right. Oh yeah, you tell that story.
Okay.
What the guys is it at or near Khe Sanh, they throw you a blanket and then you put the blanket over yourself and
They're up from I'm at the perimeter. I'm at the base perimeter, and I've walked and didn't realize how close I got to it when I realized I have to go. And there's this hill, this little bump that 100 feet up with the perimeter guards on it. And I realize I have to go to the bathroom, and I scream up, "Hey guys, where's the ladies' room?" And we all laugh, and they throw me down a big heavy wool blanket. Right. And the entire time that I'm under that blanket in unbearable heat, remember, these guys are screaming at me, "We know what you're doing." So I never wanted to come out, never. But, life is full of all kinds of things like that, and it's.
Feel yourself under pressure. Yeah. Well, it is a good book, a lot of times I'll ask combat veterans, what was the war about? And, often what combat vets will say, the war was about me and the guy next to me. That was it. And we're counting off 365 days. And that's, you refer to that too.
Exactly.
And what I think, and that's perfectly understandable to a combat vet. The war is about me and the guy next to me. I want to survive this. I want the guy next to me to survive, and he's looking out for me. And, what your memoir very successfully does is it does paint that picture of what happens to the country. This has a dramatic impact on the country. What goes through your mind when you see the guys with the Vietnam vet hats?
Oh, I feel such a deep connection, but one that that sometimes goes unspoken because I wasn't a vet, but often does not. When I say, where were you? Give them a chance to talk about where they were and then say a little bit about my experience. There were times back in the 70s, I guess, whenever all those Vietnam War films were coming out, Apocalypse Now and such. Yeah. When they were coming out, there were in the lobbies of the theaters, there were tables that vets would go up to, because the emotions were going to be so huge, and there'd be counselors. And I remember doing that. I've also over the years, before this book came out, but over the years invited to speak, because people always knew there was a book in the works, but, and I could read little bits of it, but I would speak to veterans groups, and veterans I have never met a veteran that said to me, oh, you don't know, or you don't understand, or, any version of that. It has always been such an embrace and you were there. Where were you? What do you know? Here is where I was. Da, 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 da. I mean, they're increasingly rare, right? We're dying off. It's a touchstone for me. It is. And it's a funny touchstone because our other experiences in life are probably extremely different as they were when I was there. I was there with, as I said, with young boys who didn't share my education or my background. And now I am with other people who are in their 70s who don't necessarily share a life in any way, except for this unbelievably defining experience. And that's when we meet. Enough. More than enough.
Near the beginning of the book, you say something that actually, you talk about this connection with veterans. You write something that reminds me of what I've heard from combat vets many times. And so I'll read this and then pitch my last question. You say, I'd been here, that is in Vietnam, for over a year as well. So it's near the end, and you're up in Pine Tree. This is at the beginning of your book. The truth of the matter, steeped in incongruity, was that I loved the exhilaration, felt more alive than I'd ever felt, and wished I could find a way to make the feeling last. And there's that thing I hear from many vets that, Vietnam was the worst experience of my life, and also in a way the most awesome thing I've ever experienced. Does that, and one of the things they say is because everything was so intense, and now this is the combat vets I'm talking about, things were so intense and simple, right? The questions were simple and also hugely important. Every day as a combat guy out in the boonies, you're asking very important questions, the answers to which usually are really simple. And, and there's this exhilaration that goes with it, even though it's at the same time horrible. It sounds like you identify with that.
Oh, yeah. To that point, the book Girls Don't, which is subtitled A Woman's War in Vietnam, that was not the working subtitle until I got to publication. It was Coming to Life in Vietnam.
Wow, yeah.
And that is what you're talking about. And in fact, my husband calls me an adventure seeker. And I do believe that probably my entire life has been a version of finding a much lesser version of finding that moment that you're totally, fully involved in, alive, so that you are alive. All your senses are alive. We go through life, Preston, it appears, half awake. I do, sometimes even less. And what we think of as engaging is seldom in full. I can remember feeling that river rafting, that sense of, on a really bad river, really the Collie in West Virginia. I remember that feeling of, oh boy, those rocks are sharp and I may not be in this raft for very long. Yeah. But that kind of thing where you can't think of anything else. You can't imagine anything else because everything has to be alive in this moment. So yes, that's we don't often get to do that. And I don't know if we could live a life fully that way. I guess we couldn't, but I understand people saying it was the worst of times. It was the worst of times. And it was, I'm not going to say the best of times. It was the time I was most alive. And I did call it coming to life in Vietnam.
Wow. Well, Annette Miller, thank you very much. You've written a great memoir, and I appreciate your willingness to talk about it and to share your thoughts. Thank you.